Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Vanessa Young, and I'm the chair of the Faculty Affairs, Inclusion, and Retention, or FAIR Committee. The FAIR Committee serves the faculty at large in issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in teaching, research, creative work, service, and more. In 2020, FAIR developed a 3-year workshop series centering on pedagogy, language, and representation, respectively. Here in year 2 of the series, we're focusing on the importance of language. We kicked off this year's Language Matters events in the fall with a reflection on Jacqueline Woodson's Christian culture lecture and the importance of storytelling and doing meaningful work in the world. And so to continue our discussion and our consideration of the power of language, this evening's Language Matters program invites us to consider the weight, responsibility, and opportunity that language affords us in holding up or silencing stories, voices, and identities. At this time, I'd like to invite my colleague and fellow FAIR member, Dr. Jamie Wagman, to introduce this evening's speakers. Dr. Wagman.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'm so happy to introduce our speakers tonight in the order of which they'll give their presentations. And please hold your comments and questions until after the presentations in the chat. Nell Haynes is a visiting assistant professor in global studies and faculty fellow in Quill. Her research addresses themes of gender and indigeneity in Latin America. Specifically, she is interested in the ways that notions of who counts as authentically indigenous become expressed through and troubled by popular culture and media. She is the author of Social Media in Northern Chile and co-author of How the World Changed Social Media. She is currently finishing her second book on women's lucha libre in Bolivia, titled Chola in a Chokehold, Reimagining Indigeneity Through Bolivian Lucha Libre. Andrew J. Pierce is an associate professor of philosophy and director of justice studies at St. Mary's. He earned his PhD in philosophy from Loyola University, Chicago. His specialization is social and political philosophy, broadly conceived, with interests in critical theory and the philosophy of race. He is the author of several articles in these areas, as well as a book, Collective Identity, Oppression, and the Right to Self-Description. Recently, he has been exploring restorative approaches to community engagement, as well as theoretical frameworks for understanding racial scapegoating. Thank you so much to you both.
Okay. Hopefully everyone is seeing my PowerPoint now. So I'll start off by saying that this is actually research that I did between 2013 and 2015, and then wrote this in 2016. And since it's about internet technology, some of it's a little out of date now, but I think the overall argument still is both important and continues to stand. So Chile's Tarapacá region is geographically peripheral within the country, economically exploited, and politically disenfranchised. Despite its reputation as an inhospitable place, the area draws large numbers of migrants from nearby Bolivia. In this border region, locals have a long history of perpetuating animosity and structural injustices toward migrants. These practices are sustained by discourses that situate migrants as backward, unhygienic, uneducated, plunderers of limited resources, and contributors to cultural degradation. Sentiments toward Bolivian immigrants take on a racializing character, conflating Bolivianness with indigeneity, and in order to differentiate between others and true Chileans, quote unquote, who are assumed to be non-indigenous mestizos, or people of mixed race. These discourses have circulated through official policy, news media, and everyday speech. More recently, social media platforms have become spaces for locals to perpetuate anti-immigrant discourses, often through humorous genres and specifically memes. In doing so, they reproduce nationalistic understandings of race and modernity that contrast with perceptions of Bolivians as indigenous and culturally backward. These discourses reinforce inequalities that immigrants experience, even as most Nortinos, people living in the North, are marginalized within the nation as well. So on these maps here, I just have a black circle and then a red dot roughly in the area I'm talking about. So in my research, I consider these anti-immigrant memes as part of a spectrum of extreme speech, which draws attention to discursive continuities between objectionable rhetoric and mundane genres that make anti-Bolivian sentiments more palatable to a general audience. I use critical discourse analysis to examine Facebook posts that draw humor from long-standing negative discourses on Bolivian immigrants. So I'll use some linguistic terminology, but I'll kind of explain it as I go. Nortinos view these posts as "weyes chistosas nomás," just funny stuff. However, I argue that their relationship with more extreme language in combination with their quotidian nature work insidiously to reinforce racialized discrimination against Bolivian immigrants. Their memes subtly support discrimination against immigrants by casting real Chileans as more deserving of social and economic resources. But understanding wider national and global systems that economically and politically marginalize almost all residents of the region forces us to consider the individuals who create and share these memes, not as simple bigots, but as part of a broader struggle for resources and recognition. So in the examples in this article, I demonstrate not only how mundane humor and extreme speech are intimately connected, but also how these nested forms of marginalization provide conditions conducive to discriminatory discourses or discrimination in general. So as I said, this paper is based on ethnographic fieldwork that I did between 2013 and 16, using what's been called internet-related ethnography to follow discourses across multiple online and offline instantiations. And I concentrate here on a type of meme called the image macro, which combines text and image. The format is used to express a variety of sentiments, but most often we associate image macro memes with humor, cats desiring cheeseburgers, or Willy Wonka's ironic request to go on, as seen here. So this humor is an effective means often for commenting on mistakes and hypocrisy of the powerful, making memes often called a weapon of the weak. But Nortinos often leverage memes against the weakest members of society, thereby carving out a space where they may symbolically gain power to denounce those with less. Like other forms of social media, the content of a meme is made meaningful through relationships to cultural discourses that exist within and beyond social media. The ideological positioning on racial categories and citizenship evident in the memes I analyzed was similar to that found in local and national politicians' speeches, news stories, conversations among friends and family, and as I explore here explicitly, graffiti. So I'll use critical discourse analysis to uncover the intertextual relationships of discourse in disparate genres. Intertextual meaning looking at how similar themes pop up in different places. So in my first few months in Tarapacá, I noticed a number of walls inscribed with graffiti about Bolivians. This one here reads, "Cholos fuera, bolis pataraja monos culiao," or Cholos, which is a word for urban indigenous people, get out, dirty-footed Bolivians, effing monkeys. The second, which is kind of more to the point, is muerte a los bolivianos, death to Bolivians. And then the third kind of perplexing one is, oh, sorry, I did that in the wrong order. That's muerte a los bolivianos. This is the third one. Cuidado con los brujos bolivianos. Be careful with Bolivian witches, essentially. And this graffiti reflected a lot of anti-Bolivian attitudes that are common throughout Chile, but particularly in this border region. So my research was primarily based in the city of Alto Hospicio, which is about 100,000 people in the Atacama Desert. It's 5 hours from the border with Peru to the north and about 2 hours from the Bolivian border to its east. In contrast, it's more than 30 hours by bus to the national capital of Santiago. So in part because of this positioning, many residents characterize the area as marginalized and disenfranchised, citing the distance To Santiago, national politicians' disregard for the area and economic conditions of the region. Nortinos employ marginalization as a form of identification in which they reject a victimized status and instead highlight the ways that they toil through hardships and struggle to improve living conditions. And many of them comment that they believe the vast mineral resources of the region are exploited for the economic benefit of Santiago elites and foreign companies. So nitrate was first discovered in this area in the 1800s. Previous to that, it was thought of just sort of this desert wasteland that no one wanted. But when nitrate was discovered, Chile dispossessed the territory, which had been Peruvian at the time, and then also some area to the south that had been Bolivian, launching the War of the Pacific, which was from 1879 to 1884. By the end of the war, Chile has taken all of Bolivia's entire coastline and Peru's southernmost province of Tarapacá, moving Chile's northern border more than 700 kilometers north. So today, nitrate is no longer important. There's the map of the change. But copper is the major resource in this area. And the northern Chile actually supplies 1/3 of the world's copper, and that makes up 60% of the country's exports and 20% of its GDP. But this is all run by international mining companies. So workers' pay and other sorts of resources in the area don't actually reflect the immense contribution to the Chilean economy that copper has given. Chile is the most highly unequal developed country in the world, and Alto Hospicio and its people generally represent the poorest end of that divide. And so a lot of the kind of animosity comes from Nortinos considering natural resources as central to what it means to be Chilean, but something that they have to struggle to access. This gets connected to the idea that only certain people should have rights to these resources. So within that context, there is a high level of immigration from Bolivia, and immigrants are particularly vulnerable to claims that they are unfairly using Chilean resources because of economic disparities between the two countries. That often result in Bolivians being conceptualized as poverty-stricken. So though the Bolivian government has succeeded in cutting poverty drastically since 2000, Bolivia is still considered one of the poorest and least developed countries in the hemisphere. The economic differential between the two nations leads many Chileans to conceptualize Bolivians as atrasados, behind or backward, and lacking in markers of cultural modernity. These views depoliticize Chile's historical role in Bolivia's lagging economy. After losing its coastline in 1879, Bolivia's landlocked status affects industry's ability to export and import, hugely affecting their economy as well. So these notions of Bolivians as behind takes on a racializing character because many Nortinos connect poverty and cultural stagnation to indigeneity. Today, more than 60% of Bolivia's population identifies as part of an indigenous group, and less than 10% of Chilean population describes itself as indigenous. So Chileans point to Bolivians' language and phenotypic features of evidence of racial difference between the two countries' populations. They also question Bolivians' hygiene, often evidenced by the common joke that Bolivians have a particular unpleasant odor. So in this case, indigeneity is not just a racial classification, but it's tied to this lack of modernity, to poverty, and to cultural deficiency. And then over time, these social markers such as dress and language eventually supersede phenotype or biology in popular understandings of racial categories. So the process of conflating national citizenship with racial and ethnic subjectivity leads to both anti-immigrant discourses and material instances of discrimination. So now we get to the fun stuff. So the words scrawled on the walls of Tarapacá are clear examples of extreme speech. They use inflammatory naming practices such as brujos bolivianos or monos culiao, and even invoke death as in muerte a los bolivianos. But less extreme manifestations of these same anti-immigrant discourses appear on Facebook walls as well. Some genres simply complain in clear language about the presence of Bolivian immigrants, but memes use humor and usually garner far more engagement. So I have 3 examples here. The first was shared by 40-year-old Catalina in early 2014. The photo depicts Big Bang Theory character Sheldon with his t-shirt pulled over his nose and mouth, spraying an aerosol can. And the meme simply states, anti-Bolivian repellent. This type of meme uses an image drawn from media with a popular following in the area overlaid with language that's explicitly anti-Bolivian. The aerosol can could easily be interpreted as air freshener, a reference to joking discourse about the propensity of Bolivians to have a foul odor. But this meme also works on a double entendre. The text suggests something more extreme than simply mitigating unpleasant smells. Anti-Bolivian repellent is associated with bug repellent, which either drives them away, as may be suggested by the graffiti "Cholos Get Out," or worse, the graffiti that warns death to Bolivians. A second meme was shared by at least 10 different Facebook users from Alto Hospicio over several months in 2015. The underlying image depicts Giorgio A. Tsoukalos, I think that's how you pronounce his name, from History Channel's program Ancient Aliens, another popular television show in the North. This alien expert's face is contorted mid-speech with text written above. There's only one explanation for this, and below his face appears the answer: Bolivians. This meme was posted almost exclusively as a comment on other friends' Facebook posts. Usually the original posts were complaints about quotidian annoyances like neighbors playing music too loud or too much traffic on the commute to work. And then the image underlying the text plays an important role. Given the photo's origin, the expected finish to this sentence would be aliens, thus drawing a parallel between aliens and Bolivians. And the connection is less direct than when used in English, the word alien. But Chileans also recognize a confluence of the concepts of extraterrestrial beings and foreigners. So this particular image is especially appropriate in referring to Bolivians and blaming them for social ills. And then the final meme was posted by a man named Jorge in his early 30s in July 2016. So he shared this meme depicting an Altiplano indigenous man at a social gathering. The man's brightly colored stocking cap is the visual focus of the image. It's overlaid with the text, "Meanwhile in Terra Bolivia, more Chilean than ever, hayaya." And the humor here works on a couple different levels. First, morphology, which means like different parts of words. Lexicon, the words themselves and their meaning, and then also through an incongruence of image and language. So morphologically, we have the word Terra Bolivia, an amalgamation of the words Terra Paca and Bolivia. This alludes to a sense that the two are becoming indistinguishable. As the latter encroaches on the former, it evokes the idea that Bolivia or Bolivians are intruding on the region of Terra Paca. On the level of wording, the lexical level, the meme prominently uses the word hayaya, which is an Aymara and Quechua word that unites concepts of hope, festivity, and blessings. The word is commonly used by Bolivians in celebratory contexts, but this contrasts sharply with a number of distinctly Chilean words, such as huella or culiao, as written on the physical wall in Alto Hospicio. Chilean Spanish is well known for a distinct cadence, conjugational forms, and extensive slang lexicon. Slang in memes and other public texts act as a marker of the writer's or sharer's Chileanness. This meme instead uses hayaya as a marker of Bolivianness, because Chileans would more likely use something like concha tu madre to capture that sort of festive celebratory spirit instead of hayaya. So although both locally inflected words evoke extreme emotion, the latter would be understood as distinctly Chilean, whereas the former is marked as other. Finally, considering the way the image frames the text, we see a direct contradiction between more Chilean than ever and the man with his eye-catching hat, which is distinctly not Chilean by local standards. This style of dress is usually accompanied by leather or rubber sandals and associated with rural areas and agrarian lifestyles. Individuals wearing such a hat are likely to also be wearing sandals and frequently walk through mud and dust in agricultural fields, leaving their feet dirty. This image then is precisely what one would associate with a dirty-footed Bolivian. Indeed, the man's facial features, missing teeth, and garments as well as the appearance of other individuals in the background of the photo, and even the word Hayaya, work to racialize Bolivians as indigenous, and by contrast, reinforce the notion of Chile as a country of mestizos. Overall, this framing establishes Bolivian immigrants as distinctly the opposite of more Chilean than ever. So in each of these memes, humor mitigates the extremity of ideas, but critical discourse analysis reveals the ways this humorous genre relies on discourses present in more extreme speech. Considering the genres of meme and graffiti as intimately connected reminds us that seemingly mundane statements are always part of larger and sometimes more dangerous discursive circulations. Looking beyond the internet, these online texts draw on already established media representations and political rhetoric. They're contextualized by politicians and news organizations that associate foreigners with crime, including Chile's President Sebastián Piñera. Oh, I thought I had a picture of him in there, never mind. Who has equated bands of delinquents in Chile with immigrants. As Van Dyke notes, dominance may be enacted and reproduced by subtle, routine, everyday forms of text and talk that appear natural and quite acceptable. Hervik notes that humorous texts may foreclose discussion, allowing those who invoke them to contend that adversaries simply don't understand the comedy. Precisely because anti-immigrant memes use humor, they have greater impact entering everyday discourse and thus desensitizing the issue, so that the sight of extreme speech on any sort of wall is less noteworthy. Meme language may appear as superficial, but certain instances of anti-immigrant violence remind us of the material consequences. For example, in July 2017, a group of fishermen in the northern town of Tocopillo doused 2 Peruvian immigrants with gasoline and set them ablaze. The men survived, but the incident took place amid, quote, an increasingly heated debate over the recent surge in migration in Chile and growing racial tensions, as reported by The Guardian. And this violent incident stood amid far more numerous smaller attacks. So the kinds of discourse represented by these memes painting Bolivians as racially distinct and suggesting they take up resources provide, or at least reinforce, foundational assumptions on which the more extreme texts on physical walls rely. This confluence of discourse between public walls with anonymous writers and social media accounts with named sharers provides an example of how discourses in virtual spaces are always linked to those circulating outside of social media. The memes also provide members of the public a space to express extreme opinions insidiously, even if the sharer does not recognize it as such. When asking Nortinos about anti-immigrant sentiments in both memes and graffiti, many explained them as a way of alleviating frustration about immigrants and related it to stress about their own marginalized or precarious position. The examples then further point to the nested marginalization in creating conditions that support or naturalize exclusionary discourses. In the case of Nortinos, their positioning outside economic and political power leads them to define Chileanness narrowly and creates urges to protect the resources of the area from outsiders construed as less deserving. For people who consider their marginalization to be closely connected to a lack of public forum to express their frustrations, social media becomes an important site for defining and further reinforcing their own definitions of who belongs in Chile. The extreme speech of the physical walls and the mundane humor of the virtual walls work doubly to paint real Chileans as more deserving precisely because they're marginalized within the nation and global capitalism. But looking beyond northern Chile, this example demonstrates how memes provide a public forum for grievances, yet temper them through humor, formalism, and the collectivity of sharing. These 3 aspects of memes further reinforce group identity through limiting full understanding of the text to those who are familiar with the humorous genres relevant in the in-group and who recognize the kinds of formalism at play. So although memes may often be a key way in which marginalized people are able to speak back to power, the same features that make this work possible may equally be employed for its opposite effect. Memes give voice to those who consider themselves voiceless, but may also shield them from culpability for racist and xenophobic speech.
All right, let me just share my screen here. From the beginning. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Haynes, for that very interesting talk. And thank you to the Faculty Affairs, Inclusion and Retention Committee for organizing this panel. My contribution is based on an article I published a couple of years ago called "Whose Lives Matter? The Black Lives Matter Movement and the Contested Legacy of Philosophical Humanism." And I think it fits well within this Language Matters series because it begins from a question of language. Specifically, it begins with an examination of the statement, Black Lives Matter, as well as the rhetorical challenge to that statement represented by the All Lives Matter response. And one of the things that struck me about that whole dispute was that it seemed oddly familiar. And that's because it reflects a kind of philosophical debate about humanism and universalism that's central to the discipline of philosophy of race in which I work. This debate dates back, or at least points back, to the origins of Enlightenment era humanism and to the birth of the modern concept of race in roughly the same period. So what I'm going to do today is try to explain how this Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter debate, if you like, connects to this core issue in the philosophy of race, the issue of how racial categories and racial difference fits within a universal humanism that also, in some sense, holds that all lives matter, although I'll suggest in a somewhat misleading way. By the end, I hope you'll begin to appreciate that, like the abolitionist and civil rights movements before it, the Black Lives Matter movement is not just a political or social movement, but it also has a philosophical dimension that reflects some of the most important critical work being done in the philosophy of race today. Okay, so let's begin with the statements themselves. Actually, let's begin with a really brief history of the Black Lives Matter movement. If you don't know, the Black Lives Matter movement arose in 2012 in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin and the subsequent acquittal of his killer. As with so many movements in the age of social media, the name derived from the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And without getting into too much of the complexities of social media communication, I think it's fair to say that these hashtags function much like spoken language. Hashtag Black Lives Matter is something like a sentence or a statement. At the same time, it aimed to draw attention to deep systemic inequalities within the criminal justice system, inequalities that make Black folks more likely to be profiled, arrested, and incarcerated, more likely to receive harsher sentences for similar crimes when compared to whites, and perhaps most damningly, more likely to be victimized by police violence. But the pushback against this movement, and whenever there's racial justice movements in the United States, there's always pushback. This pushback directed our attention away from the racial inequities and toward the language itself, the statement itself, Black Lives Matter. What does it mean? Does it mean that only Black Lives Matter? Does it mean that Black Lives Matter more? Is it normative? Is it descriptive? What is it? And out of this, I suspect somewhat disingenuous questioning, came the competing slogan, All Lives Matter. Now, this debate has kind of faded into the cultural background a little at this point, but if you remember it, it was quite a contentious issue. All Lives Matter was forcefully rejected by BLM activists, causing all sorts of trouble for politicians who assumed that saying all lives matter would be an easy way to superficially acknowledge Black Lives Matter, while also pandering to everyone else, as politicians like to do. Other public figures too found themselves in hot water for using the phrase, from baseball players to actors to musicians. And to add rhetorical fuel to the fire, both sides readily accused the other side of racism. So one of the things I want to do here is get clear about what is objectionable about All Lives Matter, because on the face of it, just in terms of its literal meaning, it seems pretty unobjectionable, right? And one of the characteristics of philosophical reflection is to be charitable to one's opponents, to begin by considering an idea in a fair and sympathetic way, even if ultimately one disagrees with it. So, for those who defend All Lives Matter, I assume that their thinking is something like this. All lives includes Black lives, so it affirms the essence of Black Lives Matter, the statement, but it also affirms the lives of everyone else, who of course also matter. If you interpret it in that way, it probably does seem strange to you that anyone would object to the formulation. And when BLM supporters say, no, that's not what we mean, perhaps this leads the All Lives Matter camp to assume that Black Lives Matter is intended to imply that only Black Lives Matter, which might explain why some then accuse the movement of being racist or of reverse racism, right? Now, I think that's about as charitable as you can be. And even on this charitable interpretation, let me be clear that I think the view is fundamentally wrong. It misunderstands the movement in serious ways. It serves, intentionally or not, to undermine racial justice, and it continues, consciously or not, a problematic history of dehumanization. And that's where I want to connect with this philosophical history, because the critique of All Lives Matter boils down to the idea that the universalism it lays claim to is not genuine. It's a false universalism, a thin coat of universalist paint over deep fissures of racial domination and inequality. And this is essentially the same critique that philosophers have leveled against Enlightenment humanism itself, an ideology that claims to be grounded in the universal recognition of human value, but has historically coexisted with and even attempted to rationalize a number of atrocities, from colonization to slavery to genocide. Okay, so it's tempting here to delve into a complex intellectual history of humanism, rationalism, philosophical liberalism, and how these things all converge in the European Enlightenment. But I don't have that kind of time tonight, so I'll just say this with a caveat that I'm simplifying a complex period of social, political, intellectual, and scientific transformation. The basic goal, the basic idea of the Enlightenment was to articulate a rational basis for all human endeavors. By grounding human endeavors in reason, the idea was that we could accelerate progress in science, medicine, morality, politics, even arts, virtually every sphere of human activity. It was the Enlightenment that gave us philosophical liberalism, the political philosophy that declared that all men are created equal, and derived from that assumption of equality a number of familiar universal rights and freedoms. This, of course, is the philosophy that forms the backbone of the US Constitution and of many other liberal democracies in the world. But this inspiring humanist ideology has a dark underside. The Enlightenment thinkers who developed these radically egalitarian philosophies were, at the same time, some of the first thinkers to try to provide an intellectual justification for racial hierarchy. I'll give you two quick examples. The first, the famous German philosopher, Immanuel Kant. Kant makes reason the backbone of his critical philosophy. So, for example, if you see this quote here, that all our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to the understanding, and ends with reason. There is nothing higher than reason. Now, Kant uses this emphasis on reason to derive, among other things, a moral philosophy that provides a compelling explanation of the inviolable dignity of human beings. And that moral theory remains one of, if not the most influential moral theory in contemporary academic philosophy. Very influential philosopher. And yet, Kant also said this: humanity exists in its greatest perfection in the white race. Yikes. He thought this because he thought that whites were the most rational and that other races were inherently less rational and thus inherently less human. He develops this whole systematic view of race in his anthropology that has just more recently begun to be studied by Kant scholars. Okay, one more example, real quick. Thomas Hobbes, one of the first philosophers to suggest that human beings were by nature equal. I won't read through this whole passage here from his text, The Leviathan, but that's essentially what that's getting at. He also, at the same time, reflects upon the quote unquote savages of the Americas and marks them out as exceptions to his rational political philosophy, grounded in the necessary consent of the governed. And here's Thomas Hobbes from that very same text saying the savage people in many places of America have no government at all. and live at this day in that brutish manner, as I said before. Okay, so some people might be tempted to say, and some historians of philosophy have said, so what, right? Of course, these two white guys from 17th century England and 18th century Germany have, regressive ideas about race. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? What does this have to do with their broader philosophies? Is this a throwaway comment that we can ignore? But I don't think so. Actually, the fact that Enlightenment humanism has this racial subtext, and Kant and Hobbes are certainly not the only examples of it, it's very important for understanding the historical influence of their thought. Because there's something very peculiar about this period in history. At the very same time that you see all these great humanistic values emerging, freedom, equality, democracy, human rights, you also see in practice slavery, colonization, expropriation of indigenous land, and so on. Things that if you really subscribe to these humanistic values, it seems like you shouldn't do to people, right? But when you recognize the racial subtext of European humanism, you realize that in a way it provides a rationalization for those activities because it excludes people of color, and also women, by the way, from its conception of what it means to be fully human. So this is a really key point. Humanism always runs the risk of dehumanization. If you're going to define what it means to be human in some concrete way, you run the risk of excluding people, perhaps intentionally, although perhaps sometimes unintentionally, from the moral protections that are grounded in your conception of humanity. And you see this explicitly in the history of slavery, for example. The common defense of slavery was that slaves were not fully human. They needed to be controlled by more rational white people. Perhaps the clearest illustration, though, of the abuse of this kind of rational humanism occurred with Spanish colonization. When the Spanish colonized parts of Latin America, they actually employed a distinction between the gente de razón, the people of reason, and these were people who could trace their ancestry fully or at least in part to Spain, and the native indios, who were referred to as sin razón, without reason. And that distinction was used to justify the subordination of the indigenous population. Okay, so that's a really quick overview of what I call in the paper European humanism, focusing on this problematic sort of dual character or this racial subtext. Now, from the very beginning, non-European peoples resisted this narrative, both politically and intellectually. And this is where I want to note the philosophical dimension of Black humanist thought and practice that'll bring us back eventually to Black Lives Matter. So when we think of the abolitionist movement, for example, we tend to think of it as a movement to end the practice of slavery. And of course it was, but there was a philosophical prerequisite to that legal and political task. In order to convince white Americans that slavery was wrong, Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass had to first convince them that slaves were fully human, that they deserved the same rights and protections that European philosophers had grounded in human rationality. So here's a quote from Douglass, sort of making a similar point. He says, "You profess to believe that of one blood God made all nations of men to dwell on the face of all the earth, and hath commanded all men everywhere to love one another. Yet you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own. You declare before the world and are understood by the world to declare that you hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," of course, a quote from the Constitution. "And yet you hold securely in a bondage which, according to your own Thomas Jefferson, is worse than ages of that which your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose, a seventh part of the inhabitants of your country." Another example from the civil rights movement. We often think of the civil rights movement as a movement to challenge specific forms of legal discrimination, Jim Crow segregation, for example, but it too had a philosophical core, which you can see in this quote from Martin Luther King, that the Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his own Olympian manhood. Any movement for the Negro's freedom that overlooks this necessity is only waiting to be buried. With a spirit straining toward true self-esteem, the Negro must boldly throw off the manacles of self-abnegation and say to himself and to the world, I am somebody. I am a person. I am a man with dignity and honor. And I just want to note how this message was reflected in the famous Memphis sanitation workers strike, where many of the demonstrators held this sign that said, I am a man. I also want to flag quickly this idea, this problematic equation of humanity with the term man, right? The gender exclusive language. I'll come back to that in a moment because actually that's part of this project of expanding one's notion of humanity, is challenging the gender exclusiveness of these conceptions as well. Okay. But what I want you to notice is that in each of these movements, the core of the message is not primarily about policy changes. These movements certainly had political demands, but underneath those political demands was a consistent effort to challenge and expand exclusionary notions of human being. Black philosophers and scholars of Black intellectual history have consistently noticed this, that these and other protest movements, including many decolonization movements in Africa, rely on a kind of Black humanism, which understands itself not merely as a theoretical endeavor, but as a theory-informed practice, a praxis. The idea there being that the theory and the activism are part and parcel of a single kind of project. Sylvia Wynter is one such philosopher who I've really enjoyed learning more about, who developed an influential theory of humanism as praxis. This is a recent book on her work called On Being Human as Praxis. Nicely encapsulates her view. This is a simple but very clear quote from her work that says, we must declare that there is no such thing as subhuman, and we must treat each other as if this is so. So I want you to think of this as kind of the response to that exclusionary form of European humanism that has this racial subtext, even if, as it sort of superficially insists on the shared humanity, the value of shared humanity. Okay, so let me briefly return to Black Lives Matter as a movement, not merely as a statement, to note that it fits very well within this understanding of Black humanism as a living, evolving praxis. So this is a statement from the founders of Black Lives Matter. It's sort of self-understanding, where they say Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of Black folks' contribution to this society, our humanity, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. And I want to give you one more quote from the founders to, again, sort of make this point that, for Black humanists, the idea of grounding moral and political progress in humanity and thinking of that as a praxis means that it's always in need of revision, right? It's not just a scholarly practice of like getting the right definition of human being and then relying on it. It's something that happens through activism as much as through scholarship. So think about this quote that says Black Lives Matter, quote, goes beyond the narrow nationalism that can be prevalent within some Black communities, which merely call on Black people to love Black, live Black, and buy Black, keeping straight cis Black men in the front of the movement, while our sisters, queer and trans and disabled folk take up roles in the background or not at all. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It centers those that have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. It is a tactic to rebuild the Black liberation movement. So again, the idea is that the conception of humanism, I argue, that is at the core of the Black Lives Matter movement. is not just challenging European humanism and its racist exclusions, but even within Black liberation movements, challenging the way that they have been historically exclusionary, for example, marginalizing women and queer folks within their liberation movements. So that's a nice example of this, how this praxis sort of consistently expands the notion of humanity that these movements are grounded in. And I'll just say really quickly then, going back to the all lives matter thing, when you understand this history, the way that humanism has been historically used, a superficial humanism has been historically used to erase people of color and people of color's humanity. It gives you a kind of a different view on all lives matter, right? You're sort of seeing history repeat itself in a way where this sort of false universalism, the superficial universalism, is used actually as a way of denying the concrete claims to be recognized as human that Black folks are making. So I will leave it at that. I'm happy to share the paper with anyone who wants to see it. It goes into a little bit more detail, but that's kind of the basic trajectory of the argument.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Haynes, Dr. Pierce, for sharing your research and your ideas with us. There's quite a few students, faculty, staff, and we definitely have time for questions. So please enter your questions in the chat. And someone asked, can they have a recording of the event? You can contact any one of us on the panel and we can share a link with you, absolutely.
Also, the chapter of the book that my talk was drawn from is open access, so I can give anyone a link to that too if they're interested.
Dr. Morales, I see that you raised your hand. This is actually a webinar format, so I don't think participants, attendees can necessarily vocalize their question, but please feel free to ask a question in the chat.
There is a question here in the Q&A section. Someone is asking how the copper issue relates back to how the people of Tarapacá, Chile identify and use language.
Yeah, so that's the part I cut with much abandon when trying to get this talk down to the right size. Yeah, so copper is important because it's really the source of claims to modernity for all Chileans. But for those in the north who are closest to the copper industry, who are working in the copper industry, it also kind of symbolizes the extreme wealth disparities and other kinds of disparities and precarity that they experience. So it's kind of this two-pronged or two-sided background to everything. Copper is what connects Chile to the global trade. It's provided the funding for Chile to be really at the technological forefront of internet and digital related things for several decades now. So in a lot of ways, copper is essentially what distinguishes Chile from Bolivia in a really positive way for them. And it's also the natural resource that kind of provides resources and money more generally for Chileans in general. So I think it kind of also symbolizes that protectionism of resources, that guarding of these resources are ours, we don't want to share them for people in the north. So I think in that way, it creates a particular orientation towards immigrants and a certain kind of animosity because immigrants are perceived as challenging that that ownership. They're perceived as, you know, like stealers of resources, much the way that many immigrants, and particularly racialized immigrants in the US, are seen as taking people's jobs, taking people's resources, you know, using healthcare and social security that they're not paying into, which are obviously, and the situation in Chile is just as sort of ludicrous for making those arguments as it is in the United States. But copper has sort of created this background against which these discourses and narratives that paint Bolivian immigrants as stealing resources as the major way that they're talked about. I hope that kind of gets at what the question was asking.
Thanks so much. There's another question here in the chat. How did you all first start on this journey? What was the domino that started your passion for this work?
Do you want to go first, Drew?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's interesting you asked that. Last night, I was just tuning into a panel that the Civil Rights Heritage Center put on the work of Charles Mills, the philosopher Charles Mills, who wrote a powerful little book called The Racial Contract, which I encountered in my graduate work in a course called Liberal Theory and Its Critics. And that was really the thing for me that introduced me to this whole world, this whole field of philosophy of race, which unfortunately in philosophy, many other disciplines beat us to the punch in thinking about, critically about race and gender and things like that. Philosophy was a little bit late to that. But Charles Mills's work, The Racial Contract, really kind of jump-started that in philosophy, and that's kind of what made me interested in studying it and learning more. So definitely a book that I would recommend, Charles Mills, The Racial Contract. It's a good one. Unfortunately, he just passed away in the fall, and that was what the Civil Rights Heritage Center's panel was sort of in honor of his work.
For me, I did my dissertation research in Bolivia and then was back in the US for 2 months and then started a postdoc in Chile, and immediately sort of saw this graffiti. And having been in Bolivia for a long time right before that, I almost felt offended by it personally. I was kind of like, wait, those are my friends you're saying these terrible things about. And so it made me start kind of paying attention. The postdoc was really just focused on media and communication in general and how that was changing. But it made me start to pay attention a lot to the race issues and immigration issues, the sort of international tensions between Bolivia and Chile. And I think in a lot of ways that made the research much more relevant than it would have been just sort of seeing what people were doing on Facebook.
A couple more questions that were just asked. One is, hello, I have a question for Dr. Haynes. When Chile took northern territory from Peru and Bolivia, were Peruvians and Bolivians expelled from the region? Were they economically subjugated? Is there a history of anxiety about the Chileanness of the northern region you studied because Chileans were aware that the territory was annexed? How might the history of the Pacific War play into Chileans' current anxieties about nationalism, and which resources belong to which residents living in the northern territories?
Yeah, so at the time that the land was taken in the late 1800s, there weren't a lot of people living there because it is the driest place on earth. And, it certainly is possible to live there, but there weren't, big cities. There were kind of some small indigenous villages. And so it actually, after the war, a lot of Chilean troops were stationed there in part to sort of protect the land from Bolivia and Chile taking it back. But there were also these really huge nationalization campaigns where, religion and sort of education for both children and adults were really centered around instilling the idea of Chileanness in the population that was already there. So they weren't kicked out, they were allowed to stay essentially, but the idea of being Chilean was really made important. And part of that was also, so these were indigenous folks, but in a lot of ways, I mean, to use the phrase that was used in the United States, it was save the man, kill the Indian. It was, you know, support them to live, but extract the Indianness from them, turn them into mestizo Chileans. Sorry, I'm rereading the question to see if there's anything else. Yeah, so I think that really had a strong impact on nationalism in the North. It's kind of this seemingly paradoxical situation where people in the North feel very disenfranchised and feel left behind by the national government, and yet are really, their identities are so closely tied to being Chilean, to being proud of their participation in the copper industry, which sustains Chile. So it's, you know, kind of hard to tease out like why they hate the government so much, but are so happy to be Chileans. Yeah, but I think, I mean, the land exchange of hands of this land that happened in the War of the Pacific is still very much, you know, an issue. Bolivia keeps trying to get the Hague to like give them an opportunity to negotiate getting land back, or at least getting a tract of land, which hasn't been successful for them. I think it was in 2015, there was a big case that went in front of the court that returned some maritime, I don't know exactly the wording for maritime space, but returned part of the ocean to Peru from Chile. So there's still kind of this tension and animosity between the three countries. And I think that further contributes to the kind of nationalistic feelings. You know, protecting the sea, protecting our land is still important to Chileans in that area.
Thank you so much. There's another question here. I've been doing a lot of research on my own on immigration and the border crisis, and I'm pursuing a master's in social work. What recommendations do you have for me as to further my research?
I'll jump in. I'm certainly not an expert in immigration by any means, especially not when it comes to sort of like the policy aspect of it. But when I think about immigration in the US context, I'm drawn, actually as a philosopher of race, I'm drawn to kind of the racial dimensions, the forms of racialization that kind of govern that. And you know, I would point out that in the United States, the original kind of rules around citizenship were explicitly racist, right? You had to be a free white person of good moral character in order to be a citizen. And you know, you can read almost the entire history of immigration through that lens. You know, after the 14th Amendment, it becomes you know, more difficult to explicitly restrict citizenship along the lines of race, but they do all sorts of clever things like the national origins formula, restricting the number of people that can come in, linking it to the number of people that are already here from a particular nation and things like that, trying to sort of like freeze the racial demography of the nation and so on. And I think once you understand that history and the way that race plays into it, you have a much better understanding of some of the kind of racial anxieties that occur around immigration today. This idea, you know, that whites are going to become a minority at some point because of immigration, which is very misleading and draws on some, you know, very confusing notions of race and what it means to be white and so on. But so, I mean, that's what my attention is drawn to when I think about issues of immigration. You know, there are some interesting podcasts that I've used in class and things like that that kind of focus on that dimension. I'd be happy to share them with you if you want to email me. And I can think more maybe about some texts and so on that might be interesting to you too.
Great, thanks so much. There's one other comment from one of our colleagues here. Thanks to FAIR, if you'd like to think more about social media and language matters. And then there's a link. Unfortunately, it looks like no one in the webinar can actually see the chat, but you can check out the Why We Post project of University College London, of which Nell Haynes Research is part. So please just go to the Why We Post project.
It's all a little outdated now. As I said, we were doing the research in like 2013. But yeah, it was a group of 9 anthropologists doing research in China, India, Turkey, United Kingdom, Trinidad and Tobago, Brazil, and Chile. And I might be missing one. Italy, I think I didn't say that one. So if you are interested in social media in any of those countries or regions more generally, they don't all necessarily relate to race, but I think there are really interesting issues of class and gender and other sorts of inequalities that come out in all of them too.
Great. Well, it looks like the questions are really winding down. Thank you both so very much for your energies, for sharing your research with all of us tonight. Thank you for all the participants for your questions and comments. We so appreciate hearing your voices.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.